The Albigensians, Cathars and Troubadours. When one speaks of Catharism, one thinks immediately of that of France, moreover, to be more precise, that of Occitanie, and one thinks that this phenomenon presents itself there only, or mostly there. However, whoever wants to dig deeper into the topic finds almost exclusively books that speak of Catharism beyond the Alps. The tourist operators propose trips to visit the Cathar castles in the south of France, and when the tourists arrive, they are immediately reassured by enormous billboards on the motorways that confirm you are in Cathar country. So this is the land of the Cathars. Things aren't really like this. Catharism was a phenomenon at least as relevant in Italy too. I wouldn't want to be misunderstood. I don't want either highway signs nor coaches in search of unlikely castles. Only more information and transparency about our history. And above all that happened in France might happen in Italy too. Behind the great notoriety of Occitan Catharism, there is the work of some students, like the Alsatian Charles Schmidt and Napoleon Peyrat, and later Déodat Rocher, and, page 36, René Nelly, and also a successful television broadcast. These have not only rescued Catharism from oblivion, but they also knew how to awaken in the people of today the awareness that it deals with a glorious page of their history, succeeding in inflaming people like Simone Weil, who has written vibrant pages on Occitan Catharism. All this is missing in Italy. I do not wish to deny with this that Catharism had spread out hugely in southern France, especially in all the areas where Occitan was spoken. It was a region made up of many counties, homogeneous enough culturally and profoundly different from the north of France, where the oil language was spoken, and where there had been episodes, albeit marginal and immediately suppressed, of the presence of Cathar history. In this delightful land, in which Catharism had such a notable development, the great poetry of the Troubadours was also born. Some authors, and I'm thinking above all of the beautiful book Love and the Occitan by Denis de Rougemont, place the two phenomena in relation. Such texts were long opposed and rejected, but now such theories are starting to be analysed and also welcomed in academic circles, albeit partially. I don't see how the connection between Cathars and Troubadours can be argued. Poetry was born in the feudal courts, in the same environments that adhered to Catharism, but, and the most relevant thing to my mind, the poetry also born long after. Around 1018, we find in southern France, in Aquitaine, a group of heretics who reject the cross, baptism, and marriage. Also in neighbouring Toulouse, we find similar heretics around 1022. Heresy conquered the aristocratic and cultured classes. Around 70 years later, the one recognised by all as the first troubadour appeared, William IX of Aquitaine, whose conflicts with the church are noted, and his excommunication. The top representatives of Occitan poetry were nobles, and they were in large measure adherents of Catharism. Not all the troubadours were nobles, but one shouldn't think of a scruffy group of minstrels that went to cheer up the evenings in various castles. It characterized this aspect of the society. The troubadours who we know amount to almost 500, and they played a part, page 37, universally recognized, of spreading in all Europe not only the poetic arts, but an ideal of life, of a system of values, the role of producing an ideology. Personally, I'm convinced that the troubadours sang of an ideology already present, that of Catharism. They sang, as mentioned, of impossible love for a lady whose name must remain secret, Only many centuries later, someone thought that such silence could be due to the circumstance that the woman might be married, and so dealt with not only an unattainable love, but also one that was prohibited, adulterous. I ascribe little credibility to the idea that hundreds of troubadours all found themselves in that unhappy situation and felt the need to express it. It also needs to be taken into account that an iron rule of medieval rhetoric was that of leaving out every reference to their own biographical events. If one spoke in the first person, it was to express your personal ideas, not your personal heartache. Your personal ideas about what? About love, as the way of understanding and living love was the central question on which all the troubadours measured themselves. But it's clear that it can only be treated as a metaphor to allude to other spheres, those of literature, values, nobility, courtesy, and above all, those of religion and spirituality. If we would like to read the words of the troubadours referring to love between men and women, absurd and ridiculous things would come out, apart from the insistence on the idea that love should be an unfulfilled eternal desire. What can we think of verses to say that a woman should be faithful to her lover, and that they present infidelity towards her husband as a virtue? It makes no sense to take them literally. They are just positions that, taken literally, have led to adultery retained as one of the essential conditions of courtly love. Here another matter comes up. In fact, it remains that adultery is not to be taken literally, and it is a certainty that the troubadours never sang of conjugal love, nor love consummated in marriage, something that instead characterized the narrative in the language of oil. This difference doesn't generally come to light because it established the use of the expression courtly love for both the literatures, which came to be seen as analogous when instead they were not. Page 38, not only because they were expressed in different languages, but because they are the product of two cultures distant from each other. And the origin of such difference was, to my mind, in the different religions, beyond the fact that it was in the different circles of the feudal courts of the south, where Occitane poetry was born, that determined its content. One cannot think it pure chance the fact that the Cathars, who we will see as more advanced, were against matrimony, but not against love. The poetry of the troubadours is secular and independent and critical of the church. To the undisputed supremacy of the cleric, the knight is substituted. Courtly poetry is full of confrontations between two characters that always end to the advantage of the second person. It's not by chance that a literature in the vernacular, addressing itself to those who did not know Latin, among whom were women, while clerical culture was mainly a culture of men, the new poetry turned to address itself to all women, soon seeing themselves as protagonists in the first person. The phenomenon of the Troubadours will remain unchallenged up until the end of feminine poetry in the Italian Renaissance. It is common knowledge that the ladies of the feudal courts, as later those of the nobility and rich Italian bourgeoisie, were in large measure fervent followers of Catharism. This because, in contrast to the Catholic Church, who allowed no space in their hierarchy, an exclusion that notoriously persists, Catharism afforded them an equal space to that of men. An ultimate reason for the predilection for Catharism on the part of women could be due to the fact that according to Cathar doctrine, the baby in formation and as yet unborn did not yet possess a soul, given that the soul embodied itself only after its first cry. From here, the consensus came to perform abortions and forms of contraception ferociously prohibited by the Church of Rome, and as a consequence, a vision in which the woman is not increasingly identified with continual reproduction. As much as they were cultured, evolved, and knowledgeable about themselves, they were not, however, the mistress subjectives of the impassioned praises of the Troubadours, as was not Bice Portinari, of whom Dante sang. In both cases we are dealing with a purely allegorical discourse. I will return to speak of it when I take on the topic of Dante's Beatrice. The ideals of life and the system of values sung by the Troubadours were, page 39, extraordinarily new despite having deep roots. The key questions of this refined society of those the Cathars had been the austere and secret soul, or joie, joy, largueza, generosity, jovent, youthfulness, pretz, mirth, worth, paratge, nobility in the sense of equality among all men, values that remained in our nostalgia for a better world, and love, amor, that in Occitan is feminine gender. It is certainly not a coincidence that the Catholic Church was called the Church of Love, in clear contraposition to the Catholic Church, which they called the Church of Rome. Note the palindrome, amor, Roma. Despite the absolute identity of the times and places frequented by the Cathars and the Troubadours, despite the numerous factors that they share, when even a scholar like Arno Borscht, quite hostile when dealing with the Cathars, affirms that their spirituality resonates in the poetry of the Troubadours, many critics persist in denying a relationship between the two, because, they say, the Troubadours sang of love, whereas the Cathars were opposed to sex and love, demonstrating their not having understood either the one or the other. In the course of history, there were particularly fruitful cultural innovations, such as in the 12th century, one of the most enlightened periods, most creative and liberal in European history, in which one could say was born, in all fields but above all in literature, a specific European culture. Also, in the field of theology, the philosophy of that time, there was a tremendous passion for study, with the discovery of early Platonism, then of Aristotle, and one could dare to propose ideas and theories inside orthodoxy that were odd to say the least. It was the century of the Chartres school, of Peter Abelard and Joachim of Fiore. It was the century the bourgeoisie was born, and in which autonomy was claimed for the state and city guilds, and, on reflection, also of conscience. It was the century in which was born or diffused, despite the ever-present persecution, the great medieval heresies, that of Arnold of Brescia, Peter Waldo, and above all the Cathars. Then, with the beginning of the 13th century, repression hardened. In 1209, the crusade pronounced by Innocent III began against the heretics of southern France, the so-called Albigensians. Page 40. Under the command of the papal legate Arnaud Amaury, abbot of Citeaux, the crusade was carried out by the lords barons of northern France with their followers of cavalry and soldiers that devastated the countries of the south, Provence, the Languedoc, etc., where the nobles and a great part of the population had adhered to the Cathar heresy and so were non-violent, were unaccustomed to the use of arms, and opposed to every form of institutionalized violence, war, or death penalty, and they were annihilated. Entire cities were destroyed, an entire province, with the general massacre of the population, and also of Catholics. The taking of Béziers is a famous episode. To the question as to how to distinguish the heretics from the Catholics, Abbot Amaury, spiritual head of the Crusades, replied, "Kill everybody. God will know his own." And so it was. The entire population was massacred, as the same Abbot Amaury triumphantly asserted in a letter to the Pope. But it wasn't only a Béziers that women, children, and even priests were slaughtered. This happened in every city, in every village. The same chroniclers, on the side of the crusade, provided shocking figures and described massacres that bear the scope of genocide. The voice of the Troubadours, at this point close to extinction, was yet raised to compose that great epic poem Song of the Crusade, or Song of the Albigensian Crusade, that Simone Weil compares to the Iliad. Toulouse is at the centre of it, as Troy is at the centre of the Iliad, with the difference that the Greek poem had been written by the victors, while the song is, in great part, a work of an anonymous inhabitant of Toulouse, who sang the last pangs of the agony, not just of the city, but of an entire society destined to disappear forever. The crusade lasted 20 years, but did not suffice to eradicate heresy. The institution of the Inquisition came in 1231, with which, in another 100 years of more intense and focused persecution, from incentives, from denunciations to torture, to thousands burned at the stake, the Church succeeded in its intent. Notwithstanding the length of the crusade and the persecution, there were various attempts at recovery. So loved were both the legitimate lords of that land and Cathar Christianity, so different from this other, imposed by violence and terror. Exemplary is the story of the Althier brothers. Pietro Althier, a cultured and rich notary coming from a family of old Cathar tradition, had fled to, page 41, Italy with his brother Guglielmo in 1296, but in the early months of 1300 decided to return to France. As all the sources reported, he had no trouble rekindling his faith. It was a true, real rebirth of the Cathar Church. Many asked him to become consolati. Naturally, they lived hidden, long protected by the loyalty of the people. But they moved. Traces remained of their passage in 125 places. For several years it was a tragic game of hiding among the little group of good Christians that fled and at the same time preached and consoled, and the Inquisition that hunted them. The Church took remedial action, and in January 1307 the Inquisition of Toulouse became entrusted to Bernard Gouy. Hundreds of sentences to lifelong incarceration, to the pillory, to the destruction of homes, to the fire, were handed out to those persons suspected of helping the fleeing consolati. There are those who are condemned to burn solely for saying that Pietro Althier was a holy man. Pietro Althier was discovered in the end, following a long process, and after 20 years, on the 9th of April 1311, he entered the fire. The crusade was begun in 1209, a century of violence, immolation, and torture of every type, unspeakable grief and suffering, and a country devastated in every way. The last Cathar consolato, Guglielmo Balabasta, a questionable character who certainly didn't have the stature of Pietro Althier, went to the fire in France in 1321, the same year Dante died. There were still tortures and burnings of ordinary believers up to 1329, often the most illustrious names of the bourgeoisie, because, as the satirizing troubadour song of Peire Cardinal recites, Tartarassa ni vutur, Nos sent tan lucarn puden, quam clerco presicador sentonon es lo manen. Neither buzzard nor vulture smells so well the putrid flesh as the clerics and preachers smell where the rich are. In the meantime, posthumous trials had begun and were becoming more frequent, with exhumations of the bodies that had been burnt at the stake, the significance of which I will turn to later.